Welcome back to this series on the authorship and dating of the Gospels. We'll be looking at Matthew's Gospel. And what we're going to do in this series is a survey of a lot of data relevant to these issues of authorship and dating. We'll draw some approximate conclusions, but I'm not going to tell you what to think. You can draw your own specific conclusions from the data that we look at and from your own research. We will present a summary at the end of each video where we sum up our major points from each one of the Gospels as we go through them. So you'll remember from our introduction to this series, if you have watched that. If not, I would highly encourage you to, because we're going to assume that you know some stuff from that video. But we talked in that video about the extremely high probability that the titles were assigned to the Gospels in the first century. Now, in the Hermeneia commentary series on Matthew, written by Ulrich Luz, he says, thus the Gospel was probably attributed to Matthew the Apostle earlier than 100 CE. That leaves little time for ascribing to the Apostle an originally anonymous book, or a book that came from an unknown Jewish Christian named Matthew. So Luz is a critical scholar, and so it's not just some sort of, extreme right-wing evangelical scholars who are saying these types of things. They're critical scholars as well. Drawing from Hingel's work, Douglas Moo and D.A. Carson conclude, in short, the argument that Matthew was understood to be the author of the first gospel long before Papias wrote his difficult words, affirming such a connection seems very strong, even if not unassailable. Now next, Leon Morris points us to the oldest manuscripts with the title page preserved that do attest, and unanimously so, to Matthean authorship. Now none of the oldest manuscripts of this gospel has been preserved with the title page intact, but from the earliest ones that do have it onward, the book is invariably ascribed to Matthew. This point is of greater weight than is usually recognized. We must face the fact that throughout antiquity it is accepted that Matthew wrote this gospel, and that there is no other name in the tradition. So I wanted to take this time to pull up CSNTM for you. This is the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, and their goal is to photograph in high resolution and post images of every page of every manuscript of the New Testament that we have, every Greek manuscript, and this is an incredible task for sure. But we're talking about title pages and so forth. So this is Codex Sinaiticus, and you can see what beautiful work this is. But the title page, here's the title page of Matthew, for example. And so you go to the top, Kata Mathion. So it's not one of the oldest manuscripts. I'm just pulling it up as an example, and I'll put the link in a pinned comment for those of you who don't know about that. You actually want to go look at some old Greek manuscripts, you can do that. So what's the issue then? The attestation of Matthew as the gospel writer is unanimous in church history. It's from the earliest manuscripts we have that preserve the title page, it's always attributed to Matthew. All right, so Matthew, Matthew, Matthew. So what's the question about authorship? Well, some of that stems from a quotation by Papias. Papias says, so then Matthew wrote the oracles in the Hebrew or Aramaic language, and everyone interpreted them as he was able. Now, Papias' words come to us from Eusebius, and the difficulty with this quote is that every single word, just about, is ambiguous. What are the oracles? Is this Hebrew or Aramaic? Is this the actual language? Or is this the style? Does it refer to some sort of a Semitic style? That is, writing in Greek using Semitisms. What does interpreted mean? Does it mean interpreted from another language or from another literary style? So let's kind of take these one by one, and we will present some differing opinions for sure as we go through this. But let's first address the issue of the language Matthew's Gospel was originally written in. Carson and Moo say the mix of text forms in Matthew's Gospel suggests writing in Greek, but with knowledge of Semitic languages. There are detailed verbal connections in Greek between Matthew and Mark, and Matthew does not read like a translation from a Semitic language to Greek. So you can see how Papias' words are, a bit difficult. How are we to understand this? Well, we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But with respect to Matthew, Papias clearly attests to Matthean authorship. R.T. France notes, patristic tradition is unanimous that the author was Matthew, and no other Matthew is suggested than the disciple of that name whose call is described in Matthew 9, verse 9. The church fathers are unanimous as well. Carson and Moo say, without exception, they, the church fathers, held that the apostle Matthew wrote canonical Matthew and that it was first written in Semitic. That is true, for instance, of Irenaeus, Tertullian, Origen, Eusebius, and Jerome. So you can see how when the authorship of Matthew comes up, then this quote from Papias comes up, and that gets dragged into the picture. So now you're talking about the language that Matthew was originally written in. Do you want to say, okay, it was written in Semitic language, or it was written in Greek with Semitic style, or do you want to say Papias was wrong that it was written in Semitic? He was thinking of some other Hebrew writing, but he was right about Matthean authorship, right? So you can see how these two issues can kind of become entangled, but they don't necessarily have to be. Carson and Moo are on the side of Papias referring to a Semitic language, and they say, in short, the evidence leads to a difficult conclusion. We are gently nudged to the conclusion that Papias was wrong when he claimed that Matthew was first written in Aramaic. Now, how could Papias have been wrong about this? Well, they suggest a couple of options. It was a natural conclusion since Jesus' ministry was among the Hebrews. Papias had little knowledge of the popularity of Greek in first century Palestine, or he was confused with other Hebrew writings in circulation. Now, this is not the only option. Gundry offers a thorough analysis on this issue, and the Hebrew dialect, he's referring to Papias' words, a Hebrew dialect, then, does not imply that Matthew wrote in the Aramaic language. In other connections, we should expect the conjunction of Hebrew and dialect to form a linguistic reference, but the stylistic contrast between Mark and Matthew cancels such an expectation here. And we have yet another option. All these passages suggest that the Greek version of Matthew was earlier translated back from Greek into Aramaic. This back translation was represented by Jewish Christians, however, as the original form of Matthew. So, I want to present you with options here because you're going to run into people who will say, well, Matthew was written in Hebrew or Aramaic first, end of story. Well, no. How about there are really, really good reasons for believing that Matthew was written in Greek? We talked about some of those. Papias' quote, it's not an open and shut case. Okay, we have really good arguments for and against on either side. So I want to present you with different perspectives so that you can draw your own conclusion. I'm not going to tell you what to think on that particular issue for sure. I just want to present you with the evidence. So what about with respect to Matthean authorship? Okay, we've talked about what Papias said regarding the Hebrew or the Semitic dialect. What about authorship in general? For me, it could not be more secure. So let's look at some evidence for internal authorship first. From the characteristics of the gospel noted above, we may reasonably infer that its author was a Jewish Christian with an extensive knowledge of and a strong interest in the Old Testament, familiar with scribal traditions and with the methods of rabbinic debate, and capable of writing in good Greek, even though his own cultural background was clearly Semitic. Many of Jesus' early disciples, known to us and unknown, could fit this description, given the increasing recognition that Greek was widely used in first century Palestine, particularly in Galilee of the Gentiles. Undoubtedly, Matthew would be likely to fit the description, but is there any reason for seeing him as a more likely candidate than the others? France then summarizes the clues from internal evidence as follows. Fluent in Greek, this would make sense as a tax collector, and fluent in Aramaic as well. Literate, including possibly taking notes on Jesus' teaching. A record keeper, well-educated, perhaps a self-portrait in Matthew 13:52, and then numerous references to tax collectors and financial affairs in the gospel, which would make sense if Matthew was a tax collector. Leon Morris lists some of these discussions of financial affairs and money. Matthew uses the general word for money, namisma, and the words for gold 5 times, silver 10 times, and talent 14 times, a total of 29, whereas Mark refers to silver once and Luke has it 4 times. They have none of the other words for big currency. Of course, this would make sense if Matthew was a publican. As Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at a tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he arose and followed him. Origin is relevant at this point among the 4 Gospels, which are the only indisputable ones in the Church of God under heaven. I, Origin, have learned by tradition that the first was written by Matthew, who was once a publican. So let's look at some more of what the Church Fathers have to say. Once again, the attestation to Matthean authorship is unanimous. Irenaeus of Lyon, Matthew also issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect. We have very early attestation from Ignatius as well, who was writing in the 1st century or perhaps the early 2nd century at this point. Hengel notes this. Ignatius certainly knows the Gospel of Matthew. In a footnote, he lists some parallels, a very dense section by Ignatius, Son of God, according to the will and power of God, truly born of a virgin, baptized by John, that all righteousness might be fulfilled by him. He's just quoting, Matthew time and time again. Before we move on to the issue of dating, let's look at one final quote by Leon Morris. Matthew was not, as far as our information goes, especially prominent, either among the 12 or in the early church. Accordingly, there seems to be no reason for assigning to him such an important writing, unless, in fact, he wrote it. Very well said. Let's move on to the issue of date. That quote that we heard just a couple of minutes ago from Ignatius puts an upper limit on the writing of the Gospel of Matthew, quite obviously. There are certain presuppositions that go into dating the Gospels. Every scholar has them. Let's look at a couple. So the first one would be Markan priority, assuming that Mark's Gospel was written first. Okay, whatever date you put for Mark's Gospel, Matthew has to be after that. Okay, so that's an assumption. Another one would be apparent anachronisms. You're not going to run into this directly with Muslims, but indirectly. Because any anachronism, so a big one in the Gospels would be the destruction of the temple. Anything that remotely refers to the destruction of the temple has to be after AD 70, because some scholars, of course, are going to have the presupposition against predictive prophecy, secular scholars, for example. So therefore, Matthew has to be after AD 70, and it couldn't be right after AD 70 because it would be a bigger subject in Matthew's Gospel. So it has to be, there has to be a buffer of time there. So Matthew's Gospel gets pushed later and later. Now, like I said, this is not something that you're going to run into directly with Muslims, but indirectly, because Muslims are going to read from secular scholars, namely one secular scholar, the only secular scholar that they will cite, and that's Ehrman. So the scholars like that are going to smuggle in these sorts of presuppositions, and you're going to encounter them indirectly from Muslims. The third would be tensions between Jews and Christians, the way that's portrayed in Matthew's Gospel. Some scholars say that reflects the sort of social circumstances around 85 AD. So that's going to push the Gospel into that area. So these are all open to numerous criticisms. Scholars who would want to suggest an earlier date would cite things like Matthew's independence of Pauline writings. Matthew mentions the Sadducees 6 times, but these fell out of influence after AD 70. Matthew's preoccupation with Jerusalem, that would be a very odd fixture if Matthew was writing after AD 70. Matthew's phrasing of the flight from Jerusalem. Matthew's reference to a gift at the altar would be a very odd reference if the temple was destroyed. Matthew uses the present tense when Jesus describes the temple as a den of robbers. Woe to you, blind guides, who say if anyone swears by the temple. Once again, all of these temple references would be very odd if the temple was destroyed. Matthew's focus on Jewish persecution of the Christians instead of Roman persecution. So for some scholars, like Gundry, the question is not before or after 70 AD, but how long before 70 AD. Gundry says very clearly, how much earlier than AD 70 did Matthew write his gospel? Now, Gundry is one of those scholars who can sway the scholarly consensus, and he appears to attempt that here. Many recent sociological studies of Matthew are flawed by the unargued assumption that Matthew wrote after AD 70. Further such studies should reposition Matthew before AD 70. So where does this leave us with authorship and dating of Matthew's Gospel? Well, I would suggest some things to keep in mind as we summarize our findings from this video. We do have internal evidence in the Gospel that matches Matthew's description. It's highly unlikely that Matthew was originally written in Semitic. It's improbable that the Gospel could have been renamed from another author and distributed so quickly. The book is universally ascribed to Matthew in ancient tradition. There is no indication that the Gospel ever circulated without an appropriate title, and prior to AD 70 is most plausible. So some of you have already asked in the comments section if the attestation of history is so unanimous regarding the approximate date and the authorship of Matthew and Mark, Luke, John. How do scholars differ? Why would they differ on these issues? And we're going to talk more about that in the fourth video. That's something I've built in to our discussion of the authorship and dating of John's Gospel. So I would ask you to hold on to that question, to those types of questions, but we're going to see that the methodology that some New Testament scholars apply to the New Testament is inconsistent with their peers in other branches of scholarship. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope it was helpful in surveying the data relevant to the authorship and dating of Matthew. I'll see you next time in this series for Mark. Thanks for watching.